Good evening, Kevin Slater here again. I realized the last time we did this, I don't know, last week, that I really didn't do much of an introduction of myself. I just went straight into content. So, for those of you who may be watching this and commenting on it, let me give you a little background. My name is Kevin Slater. I actually teach public speaking in Wilton, Connecticut at the high school level, 9 through 12. But I actually also direct multiple productions at the high school, even though I don't teach the theater course. So that's it for school, for education. From a theater standpoint, I've been doing theater since I don't know, since I was in high school. I started directing in my junior year of high school. We had an unusual program that allowed studio productions to be directed by high school students. So we ran the whole thing. Very little supervision. And my first project was actually a very complex show called The Shadow Box. And it was a deep dive into, some very serious subject matter, which for a bunch of high school students was pretty ambitious. And I would argue that it may have been one of the best shows I ever directed. So there you go. I went on to do professional theater all over the place. I could drop names and all that stuff. I've run box offices and two professional theaters. I've directed, I don't even know how many productions, both musicals and plays. I prefer the deep dive on plays in the scheme of things, but I think there's an awful lot to be said about musicals as well. And I actually think they're deceptively complex in that you're trying to do everything you're doing with a play as far as character development and stuff, but then on top of it, you got to deal with, a whole lot of other people, including a music director who is doing just as much work as you are, and it's far more collaborative, which actually gets me to sort of and we my theater program has won a whole bunch of awards and all that garbage. And later I'm going to actually talk about the group. I sort of hinted at it in one of my writings, but you may not have all seen it. That literally when I did a deep dive on myself as I was thinking about week 6 and who I was going to write about from the group theater, it turns out that when I was in my 20s, I was part of a workshop theater group. And it turns out that one of the members of the group theater were actually a member of that, and I worked with her. But at the time, I had no idea who she was. She was just a member of the group, or of the workshop group. I didn't realize until this class that it was actually I was working with one of the legends I was going to be reading about some 40 years later. So go figure. Anyway, so that's a little background on me about this week's reading, because I didn't do that last week. Let's get into it. I was just talking about musical theater and the collaborative nature of having to work with other people and to get that vision together. In the first reading, I made a comment about the fact that Strasberg and Clurman got together, and what they did was a lot of talk about the production, talk about the play, talk about what it meant, talk about everything that hours on hours on the script and the concepts, and battering back and forth, and probably some drinking going on, and probably some what is theater all about, and where do we really want this to go, and all of that fun stuff. And the more I think about that, the more I had to say that some of the most successful shows I've ever worked on were the ones where we had the time to actually do that. And I would argue that time is the bane of theater. I said it in my last recording, and I'm going to say it again this week, which is that it's easy to say you need to budget the time to talk it all out. And anybody who's been in the corporate world, which I have also done, is saying to themselves, oh God, not another meeting where we're going to talk it all out, because it can be so repetitive and boring and nobody's taking anything away from it. But I'm going to flip that and say that was the corporate world for me. When it comes to actually the theater world, I could talk about it for hours, because I really think that I am a better director because of the input of the team that I'm working with, assuming that team was well formed, assuming that there is respect for the other people on the team, that when they say something, you really listen to them, and that you really respect their perspective on it. that they are bringing something to the game. They're bringing a different view that you hadn't considered as you were putting together your work and your focus on the production and your interpretation. So even though my writing about this particular reading, the first reading with the Vertel reading, was I sort of flippantly said, and then they talk, 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 talk. That talk, talk, talk can lead to, especially if you're firing on all cylinders with your team, can lead to such magic of, but what if this and what if that, which is obviously coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, tied to the whole Stanislavski magic if thing. What if we think about it this way, or what if we think about it that way? And in the end, the director has to be, in my opinion, somebody has to be the leader to say, yeah, no, that's not the direction we're going. We're going this direction, and this is my vision for it. But I think the importance of having the talk, talk, talk is that everybody has a voice at the table, as long as everybody recognizes in the end the director's going to take all that in and decide this is the way it's going to have to be. But then we could argue that the director is at the hands of, how much the budget will allow to have that happen, which also was covered in this chapter, because you can talk all you want, but in the end, you're at the whim of potentially backers and money and all of that stuff. If there's no money for it, then you can still have the vision, but you have to downsize the production values to the whatever the budget is. So that was sort of my look at the first chapter. Strasberg, Klerman, Meisner, suggesting that they needed to have a special kind of organization to get what they wanted. The interesting thing is this group of people that we all put high on the pedestal for all of this, they all break away and they end up, a lot of them become teachers, funny that, educators, because they are taking what they've learned and now they're saying, but here's my view on all of this. Here's my take on it. Here's what I think is important and what the students should learn and all of that. So the evolution of what is the Moscow theater and then turns into, the group theater and then turns into Stanislavski method and all of that stuff. It's all of these individuals who are now branching out and saying, this is my version of it. And I made a connection to it because honestly, all the people I graduated with who went through the same courses I did, the people, you all are being learned all of this already, or you're learning it now and all of that. And you're going to go out and you're going to reteach it the way you interpret it to be. You're going to use this bits and pieces the way that they work for you as an educator and or a director, or a producer, or whatever role you're in. You're going to apply this the way you think you can advance your productions and advance your students' knowledge. It's really kind of cool stuff. It's a classic case that it's always evolving. But I think that inevitably I end up coming back to the base knowledge that I got and the base knowledge that is being presented to us in the book. I also have to touch on the fact that I love the way that the author talked about Chekhov's play on musical terms, harmonizing major keys, lower keys when they were talking about plays. There's a famous story that I talked about in my writing where, and I'm not even sure whether this is lore or fact, I think I read a few things that this actually happened, was that the fact that Edward Albee was seen at the back of the house at the standing room by some critic who looked over his shoulder, and there Albee was conducting as he was directing Virginia Woolf, his own show. And was asked about it, and he said, well, I know what it sounds like. I know what the rhythms should be. I direct that way. I'm not going to lie. I know when the show is off, and I'm not a great musician, but I know I can't sing for crap, ask my wife. But the deal is that I can hear when it's out of rhythm. I can hear when the tone is off. I can hear when the author's words ring a certain way. And so I have to find shortcuts when I'm dealing with actors to sort of say, it just doesn't sound, take another tact with that. Take another look at it because it just doesn't sound right. The flow is off. The musical notes are off. And okay, so in the end, I've already talked about the fact that ended up, I didn't realize it, but I actually knew somebody of the original group theater, but had no idea who she was. But I do remember that was a re-emphasis of the Stanislavski method. So is that where we are? Is that where the U.S. version of the Russians' method, the Moscow method, ends up? Is that we all end up with Americanized or U.S. versions of what the group theater then spread out like a virus? And is that what we're all looking at today? I don't have a clear answer for that. I have my answer. I know that it works for me. So moving on to the next chapter. Yeah, it cracks me up, but there it is. A British sailing ship from France carries a sea change of entertainment to the United States. We're back to the, hey, Mickey and Judy are putting on a show, only they arrived on the Titanic, but the Titanic didn't sink. All of this just seems too fanciful to be the truth, but in fact, there it is. Once again, we end up in a barn because the group theater needs a place to rehearse there and to grow and to learn and to teach and everything that they're doing and lash it all out. And where do they end up? But in somebody's barn in Connecticut, which I wrote about ironically, is that the Danbury, Connecticut, which is where the barn was, is like, 10 minutes from my home and about 20 minutes from where I teach. But here we are back in a barn where they're all hashing it out and trying to decide what works and what doesn't work. And they're fighting, and Strasberg is rising to the top because he's charismatic, because people suddenly see that he has some way of describing, how effective memory works, but not quite the way that everybody thought it was going to be because it was a little too clunky. So now he's rethinking that. It's really sort of amazing stuff. Takeaways, I suppose I should talk about my takeaways. And I'm sorry if this is a little rambly, but when it gets to these kind of things, it's a little that for me. The Provincetown Players and the Greenwich Village Theater. I made this weird connection, and I'm like, when they branched out, of course they went to the places where there were hubs of theater, and it should be shocking to no one that theater is surrounded by places that are filled with a gay community. It was sort of for me as I was reading it. I'm like, of course that's where they landed. It's of course that's where people felt free to be who they were and explore their art. That was one of my takeaways that I added. Stanislavski's method I already talked about. The word spine when it came to the super objective. I love that. Again, for me, of course, it was called the spine. It makes absolute sense. It's the backbone of. And yet I'd never heard the term before. It's just amazing to me that I'd never come across the idea that the structure, the super objective, the through line was the spine of the show. Of course it is. Makes absolute sense. And it doesn't surprise me that the actors gravitated toward, I sort of mentioned it earlier, the Strasser approach, because it was actively participating, right? The actors got a chance to not be forced into a mold, but they got to actively engage in the material as opposed to being lectured to, which is what Clurman was doing. He was up there telling them what the book said, as it were, and instead Strasberg saying, let's try this, let's try that. Anybody who's been a teacher knows that the students are far more engaged if you can get them up on their feet, rather than actually lecturing to them about it. Let them try it, let them try it, let them try it. So that's really all my big takeaways from this particular week. So in Stanislavski and the Communion. the actor needs to be in contact with not just their fellow actor and not just themselves and the emotions that they're trying to project, but it has to recognize the audience as part of the participation. It is a triangle. It's not just the work. It's not just their characterization, but it's their interaction with the audience. Even if the fourth wall is there, they need to recognize that the audience is an active participation and participant in the whole process. So, yeah, that's about all I got. There's my ramblings. Hope you enjoyed them. Hope they made some sense. And if not, go back and read what I wrote about it. Till next week. Thanks so much from Connecticut. Bye.